obviously a frog. Mallow can be a bit cloying at times with his doe-eyed naivete, but it never really surpasses vague annoyance, at least for me, in part because he falls into a well-worn groove of the impetuous, childlike sidekick. His arc is also a classic one, a journey of self-discovery and self-acceptance, but it's a pretty first-thought tropey version of that from beginning to end. And from a classical storytelling perspective, Mallow actually has the protagonist's arc, not Mario. Mario here is, in a way that makes a lot of sense, just an avatar for the player, someone charged with carrying out the action of the game without any real agency or internal life of his own. It's just us, the ones holding the controller. But Mallow, on the other hand, starts low, grows, changes, accepts himself, learns of his true nature. Heck, he's even a chosen one, the boy who should be king. It's fun to see how Nintendo and Square basically took all the ingredients that would go into a hero character, knew they couldn't put those ingredients into Mario, and shunt them onto the very next playable character that we meet, which is Mallow.